On the coldest night of winter in New York City, a 17-year-old homeless boy made a choice that would cost him everything he had. With no money, no home, and barely enough warmth to survive, Lucas Reed chose to stay when walking away would have saved his life. In a dark alley of the Upper East Side, he wrapped an old man in the only protection he owned and waited for morning, unsure if either of them would live to see it. Winter came down hard on New York City that night, not as a gentle snowfall or a postcard scene, but as something sharp and unforgiving. The wind carved through the streets like it had intent, slipping between buildings, cutting through coats, finding every patch of exposed skin. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, the kind of cold that turned breath into fog and fingers numb within minutes. Snow had piled up along sidewalks and curbs, pushed into dirty gray banks by plows that had long since moved on. Most windows glowed warm and yellow against the dark, sealing families inside apartments where heaters hummed and dinner plates were still warm. Outside, the city felt hostile, impatient, and dangerous, especially for those who had nowhere to go when night fell. Lucas Reed moved through that cold like a shadow, shoulders hunched, hands buried deep in his sleeves because his gloves had been lost weeks ago. At 17, he was already practiced at surviving nights like this, though no one should have been. He walked not with a destination but with purpose, a keep moving, keep blood flowing. Don't stop long enough for the cold to settle into your bones. His boots were worn thin, the soles cracked just enough to let melted snow seep in, turning his socks damp and stiff. Each step sent a dull ache up his legs, but stopping wasn't an option. On nights like this, rest could be fatal. He had learned that lesson early, the hard way. The city around him barely noticed. Cars passed in steady streams, headlights reflecting off icy pavement, drivers focused on getting home as quickly as possible. People hurried by with scarves pulled tight, eyes forward, phones pressed to their ears. No one looked twice at a teenage boy with a backpack walking alone after midnight. New York had learned how to look past things that made it uncomfortable. Lucas understood that invisibility well. It had become part of him over the last 3 years, ever since his life had collapsed into a series of borrowed cutches. Shelters with time limits and nights spent counting hours until morning. Tonight was worse than most. Earlier that day, he had been told he couldn't stay at the temporary housing program anymore, too old. Rules were rules, the city always had rules, but warmth rarely made the list. In his backpack were the last pieces of his life reduced to what he could carry. A change of clothes, a notebook with half-filled pages, a photograph creased at the edges, and an old blanket that smelled faintly of laundry soap and memory. It had belonged to his grandfather, Thomas Reed, the man who had raised him and taught him how to tie knots, fix broken things, and hold on to decency even when life stripped everything else away. Lucas had promised himself he would never let that blanket go. It was more than fabric. It was proof that once, someone had cared enough to stay. On this night, as the cold tightened around him, he pressed his fingers against the worn material through the zipper of his bag, grounding himself, reminding himself that he was still here. The neighborhood he drifted into was not meant for someone like him. The Upper East Side stood polished and orderly, its buildings tall and confident, its sidewalks clean despite the storm. Security lights washed stoops and gates in white light, cameras blinking quietly above doorways. Lucas knew the unspoken rules of places like this. Walk too slowly and someone might call the police. Look lost and you became suspicious. He kept his head down, his pace steady, passing townhouses with heavy doors and polished brass numbers. Somewhere behind those walls were rooms warmer than anything he had felt in weeks. But they might as well have been another world. Then came the sound that changed everything. It wasn't loud and it wasn't clear. At first, Lucas thought it was the wind shifting again, rattling something loose. But it came again, strained and uneven, carrying something human in it that the wind couldn't fake. He stopped despite every instinct telling him not to. Stopping meant letting the cold catch up. He turned his head, listening harder, heart beginning to pound for reasons that had nothing to do with temperature. The sound came from a narrow passage between two buildings, a strip of darkness barely wide enough for a person to stand. Lucas hesitated. He had learned caution the same way he had learned endurance. Getting involved could mean trouble. Trouble could mean questions, police, shelters that wrote reports, systems that swallowed people whole and spit them back out unchanged. He had survived by keeping his head down, by not being noticed, by not becoming a problem. But the sound came again, weaker this time, and something in his chest tightened. It reminded him too much of other moments, of hospital rooms and unanswered calls, of realizing too late that someone needed help and no one had stayed. He stepped toward the alley, the light from the street fading as he moved deeper between the buildings. The cold felt sharper there, trapped and unmoving, like it had been waiting. His eyes adjusted slowly and shapes began to form. A figure sat slumped against the brick wall, wrapped in nothing but a thin robe. Feet bare except for worn house slippers already soaked through with snow. White hair framed a face etched with confusion and fear, eyes darting as if searching for something just out of reach. The man's hands shook violently as he clutched at his chest, breath coming out in short, uneven bursts. Lucas felt the weight of the moment settle over him instantly. This wasn't a situation that would resolve itself if he kept walking. The man was old, fragile, and clearly not meant to be outside on a night like this. Hypothermia didn't care about intentions or explanations. Lucas knew the signs well enough: the uncontrollable shaking, the slowed movements, the distant look behind the eyes. He had seen it before in shelters, in emergency rooms, in people who didn't make it through the night. The math was brutal and simple. If he left, the man would die. If he stayed, there was no guarantee either of them would survive. Snow continued to fall, settling into Lucas's hair, melting against his skin. His body screamed for him to keep moving, to preserve what little heat he had left. He thought about the $20-something in his pocket, the old blanket in his bag, the long hours still left before morning. He thought about how easy it would be to convince himself that someone else would come along, that help would arrive without him getting involved. He also thought about his grandfather's voice, steady and calm, telling him that character wasn't built in moments when choices were easy. It was built right here, in moments like this, when walking away felt safer than staying. Lucas took a step forward, then another, until he was standing in front of the old man. The night pressed in around them, the city carrying on just beyond the alley as if nothing of consequence was happening. In that moment, with the cold biting deep and the future uncertain, Lucas Reed made the choice that would define everything that came next. He chose to stay. Lucas Reed had learned, long before that night, what it meant to be 17 and already exhausted by the world. He didn't look like someone people would stop to help. He was tall but underweight, his shoulders permanently curved inward as if bracing against something unseen. His face carried the kind of guarded expression that came from years of watching adults decide his fate without asking his opinion. People often mistook him for older, not because he wanted to appear grown, but because hardship had stripped away the softness usually reserved for youth. Childhood for Lucas had ended quietly and without ceremony the day his grandfather died. Thomas Reed had been everything Lucas had. After Lucas's mother disappeared from his life and his father followed not long after, Thomas became parent, protector, and anchor all at once. They lived in a small apartment in Queens that smelled faintly of coffee and motor oil, and though money was always tight, Lucas never felt poor there. His grandfather believed that dignity mattered more than comfort, and he made sure Lucas understood how to stand up straight, look people in the eye, and do the right thing even when no one was watching. When Thomas passed away suddenly from a heart condition, Lucas was 14 and completely unprepared for how fast a life could unravel. The system moved quickly after that. Papers were signed, rooms were emptied, and Lucas found himself shifted from place to place with a backpack that grew lighter every time he was forced to leave something behind. Foster homes never lasted long. Some were overcrowded, others indifferent, and a few made it clear they didn't want a teenage boy with opinions and grief he didn't know how to express. By the time Lucas aged out of the last placement, he had learned not to expect permanence. Everything came with conditions. Everything had an expiration date. Survival became a routine. He learned which shelters asked fewer questions, which subway lines stayed warm the longest at night, and how to read the weather like a warning system. He learned how to stretch $1 across meals and how to sleep lightly enough to protect himself. He also learned how to disappear into crowds, how to blend into the background so no one would notice a boy who didn't belong anywhere. That invisibility was a shield, but it was also a weight. Being unseen meant being unaccounted for, and that knowledge settled deep into his bones. On the night everything changed, Lucas had already been carrying more than exhaustion. Earlier that day the caseworker had delivered the news with professional detachment: no more beds, no extensions, nothing personal. Lucas nodded, thanked her, and walked out into the cold with his backpack and a hollow feeling in his chest. He told himself he'd been through worse. He always did. But the truth was that nights like this pressed harder against his resolve, reminding him how thin the line was between surviving and disappearing entirely. The few things Lucas owned were chosen carefully. He didn't carry objects that couldn't justify their weight. The notebook mattered because it held his thoughts when there was no one else to listen. The photograph mattered because it reminded him he had once been loved without conditions. And the blanket mattered because it represented the last promise he had made to his grandfather to stay decent. No matter what the world took from him, every time Lucas wrapped that blanket around himself on cold nights, It felt like borrowing strength from someone who had already endured his share of hardship. Lucas didn't think of himself as brave, he thought of himself as persistent. Courage, in his experience, wasn't a dramatic act but a series of small decisions made daily, getting up, moving forward, not giving in to bitterness. He had seen what bitterness did to people on the streets. It hardened them, isolated them, made them cruel in ways that frightened even themselves. Lucas refused to let that happen to him, even when kindness felt like a liability. His grandfather's voice echoed in his mind often, reminding him that integrity was the one thing no one could take unless you handed it over willingly. That night, as Lucas walked through the Upper East Side, he was acutely aware of how out of place he looked. The buildings seemed to watch him, their polished facades reflecting a life he had never known. He kept his gaze steady, his movements deliberate, doing everything he could to avoid drawing attention. The cold gnawed at him steadily, working its way past layers of worn fabric, but he focused on the rhythm of his steps. Movement meant control, control meant survival. When he heard the old man's voice, Lucas felt something fracture inside him. It wasn't just concern, it was recognition. He recognized the confusion, the vulnerability, the quiet panic of someone who didn't understand how they had ended up where they were. Lucas had felt that same panic when he first slept outside, staring at unfamiliar ceilings of concrete and steel, wondering how the world could keep moving while he stood still. Seeing that fear reflected in someone else stripped away the distance he usually kept between himself and strangers. Lucas's instincts warred with each other. One urged caution, reminding him of everything he risked by getting involved. Another urged action rooted not in logic but in memory. He thought of his grandfather's final days, of how frightening it had been to depend on strangers, of how one nurse who took an extra moment to explain things had made all the difference. Lucas understood, perhaps better than most, how fragile people became when they were alone and disoriented. Leaving the old man there would haunt him in ways no amount of cold ever could. As he stepped closer, Lucas became painfully aware of his own vulnerability. He wasn't a rescuer with resources or authority. He was a boy with barely enough warmth to keep himself alive. Yet something inside him settled into place as soon as he made the decision to stay. Fear didn't vanish, but it sharpened, transforming into focus. He assessed what he had, what he could do, and how long he might last. This wasn't heroism, it was responsibility. Someone needed help, and he was there. Lucas introduced himself with a steady voice he didn't entirely feel. He spoke slowly, clearly, grounding himself as much as the old man. He knew that panic could be contagious, and he refused to let it take hold. As he listened to the man speak, repeating a name with growing urgency, Lucas felt the night closing in around them. He could feel the cold creeping deeper into his limbs, but he ignored it. His attention stayed fixed on the man in front of him, because once he allowed himself to focus on his own discomfort, everything would fall apart. In that alley, beneath the glow of distant streetlights, Lucas Reed was no longer just a homeless teenager trying to survive another night. He was someone's anchor, someone's protection against a world that had suddenly become hostile and unfamiliar. He didn't know how the night would end. He didn't know if help would come in time. What he knew with absolute clarity was that walking away was no longer an option. His life had taught him many harsh lessons, but it had also taught him this: staying, even when it cost you, was sometimes the only way to remain human. And so, with the cold pressing closer and dawn still far away, Lucas Reed stood his ground, carrying the weight of his past, his values, and a fragile stranger's life into the long hours ahead. That night, Lucas Reed was carrying everything he owned on his back, and none of it felt like enough. The decision to leave the temporary housing facility hadn't been dramatic. No argument, no raised voices, no warning sirens. Just a clipboard, a tired staff member, and a reminder that rules didn't bend for circumstances. He had reached the age limit. That was all that mattered. Lucas nodded, thanked them out of habit, and stepped back into the street before anyone could see how hollow he felt. The door closed behind him, and with it went the last thin layer of security he'd been clinging to. He checked his pockets as he walked, counting what little money he had left, $31 and some loose change. Enough for a couple of cheap meals if he stretched it carefully. Not enough for a room or even a warm place to sit for long. Lucas had learned to do this math quickly, instinctively, the way other kids his age might calculate grades or sports scores. Every dollar had a purpose. Every mistake cost more than it should have. He tucked the money deeper into his pocket, pressing his hand against it as if physical contact might make it last longer. The cold pressed in harder as the night deepened. Lucas felt it through the seams of his jacket, through the worn fabric of his jeans, through the thin soles of his boots. He knew the forecast. He always knew the forecast. Nights like this were dangerous, especially without a place to settle. Shelters were already full. Warming centers had closed hours earlier. Subway stations had begun clearing out anyone who looked like they intended to stay too long. The city had ways of reminding people that public space was never truly theirs. Lucas adjusted the straps of his backpack, shifting the weight across his shoulders. The bag was old but sturdy, found years ago and repaired with careful stitches. Inside were the items he had decided were worth keeping after everything else had been lost or abandoned. A notebook filled with an even handwriting and thoughts he didn't say out loud. A paperback book with a cracked spine he'd found in a free bin. A folded photograph of him and his grandfather standing in front of their old apartment, both of them squinting into the sun, and at the very bottom wrapped tightly the blanket, thin, frayed, and irreplaceable. That blanket had traveled with Lucas through every move, every shelter, every uncertain night. It smelled faintly of detergent and something warmer, something familiar. His grandfather used to keep it draped over the back of the couch, pulling it around his shoulders when the apartment got cold. Lucas remembered sitting beside him, listening to stories that went nowhere in particular, stories that existed only to fill space with connection. The blanket wasn't valuable in any practical sense, but it held weight that couldn't be measured. Giving it up had never been an option, at least not until this night. Lucas kept walking because standing still made his thoughts turn inward, and inward was a dangerous place. He moved through neighborhoods he didn't belong to, letting the rhythm of his steps keep him grounded. He passed restaurants closing for the night, the smell of leftover food lingering just long enough to remind him how hungry he was. He passed apartment buildings where people were settling into beds, adjusting thermostats, complaining about the cold from behind thick glass. Lucas didn't resent them. Resentment took energy, and he needed every ounce of that energy to get through the night. Being forced out that day had stirred something heavier than fear. It brought back the familiar realization that no matter how hard he tried, stability was always temporary. There was no finish line where things suddenly became easier. There were only stretches of survival punctuated by moments of rest that could be taken away without notice. Lucas had learned not to dream too far ahead. Plans had a way of collapsing under pressure. Instead, he focused on the next hour, the next block, the next decision. As he walked, he kept a mental map of his options, few as they were. A 24-hour diner that sometimes let people sit if they ordered coffee. A church basement that opened its doors on certain nights, though tonight wasn't one of them. A bus route that ran all night, if he could scrape together fare and convince the driver not to ask questions. None of these options promised real warmth or safety, only temporary relief. Lucas weighed them carefully, knowing he might have to choose one before exhaustion made the decision for him. His body was already showing signs of strain. His fingers burned, then dulled, then burned again. His jaw ached from clenching against the cold. He rolled his shoulders, trying to keep blood flowing, trying to stay ahead of the creeping fatigue that whispered it would be easier to rest. Lucas ignored that voice. He had learned never to trust it. That voice lied. It didn't care whether you woke up again. What made this night different wasn't just the weather or the lack of shelter. It was the accumulation of everything that had come before it. 3 years of instability pressed down on him at once, making the air feel heavier, the choices narrower. Lucas knew he was reaching a breaking point, though he wouldn't have admitted it out loud. He was tired of aging out of systems, tired of being told there was nothing available, tired of proving he deserved basic things like warmth and safety. Yet even in that exhaustion, there was something he refused to let go of, a line he would not cross, a version of himself he would not abandon. That was why, when he heard the old man's voice later that night, Lucas couldn't pretend it wasn't there. By then his reserves were already low. He had nothing extra to give. No spare coat, no money for a cab, no phone battery he could waste on long calls. Helping someone else would mean subtracting from himself in ways that might not be recoverable. Lucas understood that clearly. He also understood that there were moments when survival wasn't just about staying alive, but about deciding who you were willing to become in order to do so. Before that moment, as he walked with his backpack cutting into his shoulders and the cold biting at his skin, Lucas had been preparing himself for another long night alone. He had been bracing for discomfort, for hunger, for the familiar ache of existing on the margins. He had not been preparing to share what little he had left. Yet the truth was that everything he carried, every item in his bag had been shaped by loss and choice. He had already lost so much. What defined him now was not what he lacked, but what he refused to surrender. Lucas Reed walked into that night with almost nothing and the full weight of his life behind him. He didn't know that the decisions he would make in the next few hours would alter his future entirely. He only knew that the cold was real, the city was indifferent, and survival demanded more than strength. It demanded judgment, memory, and the willingness to act when it would have been easier to keep walking. Lucas Reed drifted deeper into the Upper East Side with the instinctive caution of someone who knew exactly how fragile his position was. Every step felt measured, not because he wanted to be careful, but because he had learned what happened when you weren't. This part of the city operated on unspoken rules, and Lucas understood them well enough to know he was already breaking several just by being there. He didn't belong among these buildings, these clean sidewalks, these orderly rows of parked cars dusted lightly with snow. He looked wrong in a way that had nothing to do with crime and everything to do with class, age, and circumstance. The townhouses stood shoulder to shoulder like guarded fortresses, their stone facades polished, their entrances framed by iron railings and trimmed hedges that had somehow survived the winter. Lights glowed behind tall windows, casting warm rectangles onto the sidewalk. Lucas caught glimpses of movement inside people crossing rooms, televisions flickering, someone setting a table or clearing dishes. These were ordinary moments, unremarkable to the people living them, yet impossibly distant to someone standing outside with nowhere to go. The contrast pressed against him, making the cold feel sharper, more personal. Lucas kept his pace steady, neither rushing nor lingering. Rushing drew attention, lingering did the same. He had learned how to move in a way that suggested purpose without inviting questions. His backpack sat high on his shoulders, straps tightened so it wouldn't sag and make him look more desperate than he already was. He avoided making eye contact with anyone who passed, not out of shame but out of experience. Too much eye contact invited curiosity, and curiosity often led to assumptions. Assumptions led to calls being made. Every few houses, security cameras blinked faintly, mounted above doorways or tucked into corners. Lucas felt their presence even when he couldn't see them directly. He imagined someone watching from a phone screen inside a warm living room, noticing a teenage boy moving slowly past their property. He imagined the questions forming. Why was he there? What was he doing? Was he waiting for something? Lucas adjusted his posture, rolled his shoulders back, and kept moving. Confidence, even borrowed, could be a form of protection. He passed a doorman stationed inside a glass booth, the man's coat thick and professional, his expression neutral as he scanned the street. Lucas lowered his gaze slightly, not enough to look guilty, just enough to avoid engagement. The doorman didn't stop him, didn't call out, didn't react at all. Lucas exhaled slowly and continued on, the tension in his chest easing just a fraction. Moments like that reminded him how thin the margin was between being ignored and being confronted. The streets here felt different underfoot, cleaner, smoother. Snow had been cleared more thoroughly, salt spread generously. The city invested in places like this. It showed in the details, the maintained facades, the lack of trash, the absence of broken things. Lucas wondered what it felt like to grow up believing the world would take care of you, that systems existed to support rather than discard. He didn't resent the people who lived here, but he couldn't help noticing how distance was built into the environment itself. These streets were designed to keep certain people in and others out. Lucas's breath came out in short bursts as he walked, his lungs aching from the cold air. He flexed his fingers inside his sleeves, trying to keep sensation alive. His mind stayed alert, cataloging exits, intersections, places where he could change direction if needed. Awareness was a habit now, ingrained by necessity. He knew which corners were well lit and which fell into shadow. He knew where alleys narrowed and where fences blocked quick escapes. This wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. As he moved farther north, traffic thinned. The steady hum of cars softened to occasional engines passing through intersections. The sidewalks grew emptier, and that too carried risk. Fewer witnesses meant fewer buffers. Lucas adjusted his route slightly, staying closer to main streets where possible. He wasn't afraid of people so much as he was afraid of being singled out. Attention was unpredictable. It could bring help, but more often it brought trouble. He thought about how strange it was that safety often depended on looking like you belonged. Clothes, posture, pace, these things could determine how the world responded to you. Lucas's jacket was clean but worn, the cuffs frayed, the zipper temperamental. To most people, it probably looked like what it was, the jacket of someone who didn't have options. He zipped it higher, tucking his chin down, trying to hold on to warmth that was steadily slipping away. Despite everything, Lucas couldn't stop his thoughts from drifting toward the lives unfolding behind those lit windows. He imagined dinners, arguments, homework spread across tables, phones charging on countertops. He imagined people complaining about the cold even as heaters pushed warm air through their apartments. He wondered if anyone inside those buildings had ever stood outside in weather like this with nowhere to go. If they had, would they remember it now, or would comfort have dulled the edges of that memory? The longer Lucas walked, the heavier his legs felt. The cold worked its way upward, past his feet, into his calves and knees. He focused on maintaining a rhythm, counting steps in his head to keep his mind occupied. He reminded himself that dawn would come eventually, that the city would shift again with morning routines. Night always felt endless when you were trying to survive it, but experience had taught him that time did move, whether you wanted it to or not. As he passed another row of townhouses, Lucas noticed a slight change in the soundscape. The wind funneled differently between the buildings here, creating pockets where it struck harder, then eased. Snow swirled briefly in small spirals before settling again. He adjusted his path to avoid the worst of it, stepping closer to walls where the air felt marginally less aggressive. It wasn't much, but small advantages mattered. It was in one of these narrow stretches, where two buildings stood closer together than the rest, that Lucas felt the shift before he heard anything clearly. A disturbance in the pattern of the night, something that didn't belong to the steady rhythm of wind and distant traffic. He slowed, listening more carefully, his attention sharpening, his body react before his mind fully caught up, muscles tightening, senses focusing. He had learned to trust those reactions. They had kept him alive. Lucas stopped near the entrance to a narrow passage between two townhouses, the space barely wide enough for a person to stand comfortably. The light from the street didn't reach far into it, leaving the interior dim and uncertain. He hesitated, weighing his options. This was exactly the kind of place he usually avoided. Confined spaces, poor visibility, no clear exit. Everything about it suggested risk. Yet something held him there, an uneasy pull that refused to let him continue on his way. He glanced back down the street, then forward again, aware of how exposed he was standing still. The decision pressed on him, heavy and immediate. Keep moving and preserve what little warmth and safety he had left, or step closer and find out why his instincts had flared. Lucas felt the cold creeping further into his body, his time narrowing. Whatever he chose, he would have to choose quickly. The Upper East Side stretched on behind him, orderly and indifferent, its warm windows offering nothing but contrast. Ahead lay uncertainty, the kind that had shaped much of Lucas's life already. He tightened the straps of his backpack, drawing a slow breath, and leaned slightly toward the narrow passage. He didn't know yet that this was the point where the night would turn, where walking through a neighborhood he didn't belong in would lead him directly into a moment that demanded everything he had left. He only knew that something was wrong, and ignoring it was no longer possible. The sound reached Lucas before he fully understood what it was. At first, it blended into the night, tangled with the wind pushing through narrow streets and the distant rhythm of traffic blocks away. It wasn't sharp or clear enough to demand attention immediately, and Lucas almost dismissed it as his imagination reacting to exhaustion. Long nights had a way of playing tricks on perception, especially when cold and hunger worked together to wear a person down. He took another step forward, then another, trying to convince himself that nothing was out of place. But the sound came again, uneven and strained, carrying something human that didn't belong to the patterns Lucas had learned to ignore. It wasn't loud, it didn't echo, it didn't announce itself with urgency. That was what made it dangerous. Lucas slowed his pace without realizing he had done so, his body responding before his thoughts could catch up. Years of living on alert had trained him to recognize the difference between background noise and something that mattered. This mattered. He stopped walking altogether, the cold immediately pressing closer as movement ceased. Lucas turned his head slightly, angling his ear toward the narrow stretch of buildings he had just passed. The sound drifted again, fragmented as if struggling to carry itself through the air, a word, maybe, or part of one. Lucas couldn't be sure. His heartbeat picked up, not from fear alone, but from recognition. This wasn't the city speaking. This was someone. Lucas felt the familiar pull between instinct and caution tighten inside his chest. Every lesson he had learned told him to keep moving. Getting involved rarely ended well for people like him. There were questions that followed, explanations expected, assumptions made. He had been on the wrong end of those situations more times than he cared to count. Yet standing there, listening, he knew that pretending he hadn't heard anything would be a lie he wouldn't forget. He shifted his weight, boots crunching lightly against packed snow. The sound came once more, weaker now, threaded with confusion and distress. Lucas swallowed hard. He thought about the temperature, about how quickly exposure could turn dangerous, especially for someone older, someone unprepared. He thought about how the night swallowed people whole when no one noticed they were gone. The image of his grandfather surfaced without warning, lying in a hospital bed, disoriented, calling for people who weren't there anymore. The memory hit Lucas harder than the cold. Lucas took a careful step back toward the narrow passage between the buildings. The space was barely visible from the sidewalk, framed by tall stone walls that blocked most of the streetlight. He hesitated at the edge, his mind racing through possibilities. It could be someone drunk, someone unstable, someone dangerous. It could also be someone lost sick or simply unable to help themselves. Lucas had learned that risk came in many forms, and avoiding all of them meant turning away from humanity itself. Another sound reached him, this time clearer, shaped like a plea rather than a word. Lucas closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. He adjusted the straps of his backpack, pulling them tighter as if preparing for impact. His fingers ached as he flexed them, sensation dulled by the cold. He reminded himself to stay aware, to keep distance if needed, to trust his judgment. Then he stepped into the narrow space between the buildings. The temperature shifted almost immediately. The wind behaved differently here, trapped and redirected by the walls, making the cold feel heavier rather than sharper. Snow clung to the bricks, half melted and refrozen in uneven patches. Lucas' eyes adjusted slowly, shapes emerging from shadow. A figure sat slumped against the wall, posture collapsed inward as if gravity itself had become too much to resist. The man was old, that much was clear even before Lucas saw his face. White hair framed his head in disarray, stark against the dark brick behind him. He wore a thin robe, the kind meant for indoor warmth, its fabric offering no protection against the night. His legs were bare from the knee down, skin mottled and trembling. House slippers hung loosely from his feet, soaked through and useless. One hand clutched at his chest, the other pressed against the wall as if trying to anchor himself to something solid. Lucas felt a tightness spread through his ribs. This wasn't someone who belonged outside. This wasn't someone who could get up and walk away. The man's eyes darted as Lucas approached, unfocused, searching for something Lucas couldn't see. His mouth moved, forming words that didn't quite land, names repeated without context. Lucas recognized the signs immediately: confusion, disorientation, fear layered over all of it. "Hey," Lucas said, keeping his voice steady and low, careful not to startle him. "I'm here, you're okay?" He wasn't sure if that was true, but he knew the words mattered. The man turned his head toward the sound, eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to bring Lucas into focus. I need to get home," the man said, his voice thin and uneven. "My daughter, she's waiting for me." He attempted to shift his weight, then winced, his body betraying him. Lucas moved closer, crouching a few feet away to avoid looming over him. "What's your name?" Lucas asked gently. "Do you remember where you live?" The man shook his head, frustration flashing across his face. "I know it," he insisted. "I just can't, it won't come." His breathing quickened, panic threatening to take over. Lucas recognized that edge too. He had felt it himself more times than he could count. "Okay," Lucas said, holding his hands up slightly, palms open. "That's all right. We'll figure it out." The words came out automatically, shaped by years of comforting himself when no one else was around. He scanned the man quickly, assessing what little he could. No cat, no phone, no wallet visible. Nothing that explained how he'd ended up here. The man's teeth chattered as another tremor ran through him. Lucas felt a surge of urgency cut through his hesitation. This wasn't a situation that could wait. Exposure had already begun to take its toll, and the night was far from over. Lucas glanced back toward the street, half expecting someone else to appear, someone more equipped to handle this. The sidewalk remained empty. "What's your daughter's name?" Lucas asked, inching closer. "Maybe that'll help." "Evelyn," the man said, relief flickering across his features at the familiar name. "She'll be worried." His gaze dropped to the ground, confusion creeping back in. I was just going to get something." Lucas nodded, even though the explanation didn't add up. He had heard similar fragments before, from people whose minds betrayed them without warning. This wasn't about logic. It was about keeping the man anchored, keeping him present enough to survive the night. Lucas made a decision in that moment, one that settled heavily but clearly. He couldn't leave, not now, not after seeing how fragile the situation truly was. Whatever risks waited beyond this alley, whatever consequences might follow, they were secondary to the immediate reality in front of him. The man needed warmth, he needed help, and Lucas was the only one there. As Lucas reached out, placing a careful hand near the man's shoulder, he became acutely aware of how little he had to offer and how much was being asked of him. The cold gnawed at his own body, a constant reminder of his limits. Yet standing there, face to face with someone even more vulnerable, Lucas understood that the night had already changed. The sound he had heard wasn't just a voice in the dark. It was a turning point, one that would pull him deeper into a choice he could no longer avoid. The moment Lucas understood the full weight of the situation, the night seemed to narrow around him. Standing in the cramped space between the buildings, with the cold pressing from all sides and the old man trembling against the brick wall, Lucas' time rearranged itself. This was no longer just another difficult night to endure. It was a moment that demanded a decision, and whatever he chose would carry consequences he couldn't undo. His instincts pulled him in opposite directions, each one urgent, each one convincing in its own way. The first instinct was practical, shaped by survival and reinforced by experience. Call for help, step back, let professionals handle it. That was what people were supposed to do in situations like this. Lucas knew the number by heart. He also knew what often followed when someone like him made that call: questions, suspicion. Officers arriving already alert, already assessing him as part of the problem rather than someone trying to solve one. He imagined standing there, cold and exhausted, trying to explain himself while his lack of an address, his worn clothes, and his age painted a picture he didn't control. Lucas had learned early that systems were not designed with people like him in mind. When you were homeless, every interaction carried risk. A misunderstanding could turn into a night in holding, or worse, a record that followed you into every future encounter. He had seen friends disappear into that machinery, emerging quieter, harder, less trusting. Calling for help was not a neutral act when you lived on the margins. It was a gamble, and Lucas had very little left to wager. The second instinct was just as strong and far more personal. Protect the man in front of him. Do what you can with what you have. That instinct came from somewhere deeper than logic, rooted in memory and values rather than calculation. Lucas looked at the old man's bare legs, the way his hands shook, the confusion flickering across his face. He knew exposure when he saw it. The cold didn't negotiate. It didn't wait politely for assistance to arrive. It took what it was given, quickly and without remorse. Lucas glanced toward the street again, hoping against reason that someone else might appear, someone better equipped to handle this. The sidewalk remained empty. The city continued its distant hum, detached and unconcerned. Whatever decision was going to be made, it would be his alone. That realization settled heavily on his shoulders, heavier even than the backpack he carried everywhere. He weighed the options with brutal honesty. If he walked away, the man would likely die before morning. The temperature alone made that clear. Lucas would carry that knowledge with him for the rest of his life, a quiet burden that no amount of rationalization would erase. He called for help. The man might survive, but Lucas could lose what little stability he had left. There was no guarantee the outcome would be clean or kind. If he stayed, truly stayed, the risk shifted entirely onto him. He could lose his last defenses against the cold. He could collapse before help ever arrived. He could die. Lucas felt his pulse hammer in his ears as the reality of that last possibility took shape. He was 17. He had plans he barely allowed himself to think about. He wanted to finish school someday. He wanted a room of his own, a door he could close, a future that didn't depend on luck and endurance. Dying in an alley on the Upper East Side was not supposed to be part of that future. Yet here he was, facing a choice where preserving himself meant abandoning someone else. The old man shifted slightly, a small sound escaping him as his body protested the cold. Lucas's gaze snapped back to him immediately. He knelt closer, noticing how the man's skin felt chilled, even the thin fabric of his robe. This wasn't theoretical anymore. The danger was immediate and undeniable. Lucas's mind returned to his grandfather, to the way Thomas Reed had always insisted that being decent wasn't about comfort. It was about consistency, about doing the right thing even when it hurt. Lucas remembered a winter years ago when the heat in their apartment had failed. They had sat together wrapped in layers, laughing it off, Thomas telling him stories to distract from the cold. You look after people, his grandfather had said then, voice steady despite the circumstances. That's how you stay human. At the time, Lucas hadn't understood how literal that advice might become. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. Fear didn't disappear, but it sharpened into resolve. He knew he couldn't fix everything. He knew he didn't have the resources to guarantee a happy ending. What he did have was presence. He had his body, his attention, and a few precious items that could be turned into tools if he was willing to give them up. Lucas spoke again, keeping his tone calm as he addressed the old man. He asked simple questions, grounding ones, not because he expected clear answers, but because conversation itself could keep the man engaged, alert, connected. The man responded unevenly, repeating his daughter's name, expressing worry that didn't quite attach to reality. Lucas nodded along, offering reassurance he hoped would carry weight even if it couldn't carry certainty. As the minutes passed, Lucas felt the cold working its way deeper into him. His legs ached from crouching, his fingers stiffening despite the movement. He stood briefly, pacing a small circle to keep blood flowing, then crouched again. Time felt distorted, stretching and compressing unpredictably. Every second carried urgency, yet nothing moved quickly enough. Lucas reached a point where the choice clarified itself, not because it became easier, but because delaying it became impossible. He could not call for help and then walk away while waiting. He could not stand by without acting. The only option that aligned with who he was, with who he had been taught to be, was to stay fully, to commit to protecting the man in front of him with everything he had. He unzipped his jacket, the rush of cold against his chest immediate and biting. His hands hesitated only a moment before he draped the jacket over the old man's shoulders, adjusting it carefully to cover as much as possible. The man looked up at him, confusion briefly replaced by concern. "You'll be cold," he said, the words slurred but sincere. "I'll manage," Lucas replied, though he knew the lie even as he spoke it. He had told himself that same thing many times before. Sometimes it was true, sometimes it wasn't. The decision carried weight beyond the physical. By choosing to stay, Lucas accepted whatever consequences followed. He accepted the possibility that help might not come in time. He accepted the risk that his own body might fail before morning. He also accepted something else, something quieter but just as powerful, the certainty that he would not regret this choice, no matter how the night ended. As Lucas settled back down beside the old man, pulling his backpack closer, he felt a strange calm settle over him. Fear remained sharp and present, but it no longer controlled him. He knew what he was doing and why. The city might not notice them. The buildings might stand indifferent. But here in this narrow space between wealth and neglect, Lucas Reed chose responsibility over self-preservation. The night stretched on, cold and unforgiving, but the decision had been made. Whatever happened next would unfold from that single choice. Lucas stayed. Once the decision settled inside him, Lucas Reed felt the world shift from uncertainty to action. There was no dramatic moment, no internal speech convincing him of his own goodness. There was only the understanding that waiting would make things worse. The cold was already winning, and standing still meant surrendering ground he could not afford to lose. He looked at the old man again, really looked this time, and saw how exposed he was. The thin robe clung uselessly to his frame, offering no barrier against the night. His legs trembled uncontrollably, and his breathing came shallow and uneven. Lucas knew then that staying beside him without changing anything would not be enough. Lucas reached for the zipper of his jacket and paused, his fingers hovering for a fraction of a second. That jacket had been with him through more nights than he could count. It was not warm by most standards, but it was his only defense against weather like this. Giving it up meant crossing a line he had avoided for years. It meant choosing vulnerability outright. Lucas felt the bite of the air against his neck as he pulled the zipper down, the cold rushing in immediately, sharp and punishing. He shrugged the jacket off his shoulders and draped it carefully around the old man, tucking it close, adjusting it the way his grandfather had once adjusted blankets around him. The old man looked up, confusion giving way briefly to concern. "You need that," he said, his voice strained. Lucas shook his head lightly, forcing a small reassuring smile he did not feel. "I'm okay," he said. "This will help you more." He knew the truth was more complicated, but explanations didn't matter right now. What mattered was reducing the man's exposure, even if it meant increasing his own. As soon as the jacket left his body, Lucas felt the difference. The cold no longer pressed at him gradually. It struck directly, seeping through his long-sleeve shirt. Tightening muscles he hadn't realized were already strained. He flexed his arms and hands, trying to keep blood moving, refusing to let discomfort slow him down. He had made his choice. Now he had to commit to it fully. Lucas scanned the alley again, assessing what little shelter it offered. The brick walls provided some protection from the wind, but the ground radiated cold, and the space felt increasingly unsafe as the man's condition worsened. Sitting here all night was not an option. The man needed movement, warmth, and a place where help might reach them. Lucas knew he couldn't carry him far, but staying put guaranteed the night would overtake them both. "We were going to try to walk a little," Lucas said, keeping his voice steady and direct, "just slowly. I'll help you." He extended his arm, offering support without rushing. The old man hesitated, then reached for Lucas with hands that barely seemed to respond to intention. Lucas braced himself and helped him rise carefully, aware of how fragile the man's balance was. The first step was the hardest. The old man's legs wobbled, nearly giving out beneath him. Lucas tightened his grip, shifting his stance to absorb the weight, feeling the strain run through his own body. He had never thought of himself as strong, but strength wasn't about muscle right now. It was about refusing to let go. They stood there for a moment, both of them breathing hard, the cold wrapping tighter around Lucas's unprotected frame. "Easy," Lucas murmured. "We've got time." He didn't know if that was true, but the words had a calming effect. The man took another step, then another, leaning heavily against Lucas's shoulder. They moved inch by inch toward the street, Lucas guiding him out of the narrow passage, careful to keep their pace slow and controlled. The sidewalk felt impossibly exposed after the alley. The wind swept across it freely, carrying snow that stung Lucas's face and neck. Without his jacket, every gust felt like a blade. His teeth clenched involuntarily, and he forced his breathing to stay even. Panic would make this worse. Panic wasted energy he couldn't spare. They moved along the row of townhouses, Lucas scanning ahead for anything that might offer relief. A recessed doorway, a covered stoop. Somewhere they could pause without being fully exposed. The old man stumbled again, his foot catching uneven pavement. Lucas caught him just in time, the impact jarring both of them. Pain flared in Lucas's shoulder, but he ignored it. "It's all right," Lucas said quickly, repositioning his grip. "I've got you." The words were as much for himself as for the man. He repeated them in his head, anchoring himself to the task at hand. One step, then another. Keep moving. Lucas's hands began to ache, the cold numbing his fingers despite his efforts to flex them. He could feel sensation fading in patches, a warning he recognized too well. He compensated by adjusting his hold, using his forearm and shoulder to support more of the weight. His backpack shifted awkwardly with each movement, straps digging into his skin, but he didn't stop to fix them. Stopping was dangerous. They reached the front of a large townhouse, its gate closed, its lights dimmed except for security fixtures that cast stark shadows across the stone. Lucas noticed a small recessed area near the entrance, partially shielded from the wind. It wasn't much, but it was better than standing in the open. He guided the old man toward it, helping him lower himself carefully to the ground. As soon as they settled, Lucas felt the cold surge again, relentless now that his body was working harder. His breath came out in visible bursts, chest tight. He crouched beside the man, adjusting the jacket again to make sure it stayed in place. The man's shaking had not stopped, but it had not worsened either. Lucas took that as a small victory. "You re doing good," Lucas said, keeping his tone calm. "We were just going to rest here for a minute." The man nodded weakly, eyes drifting as fatigue pulled at him. Lucas stayed close, one hand steadying him, the other pressed against his own thigh to remind himself to keep moving, to stay present. In that moment, Lucas felt the full weight of what he had chosen. The cold was no longer an abstract threat. It was a physical force working steadily against him. He knew that giving up his jacket had shortened the amount of time his body could endure these conditions. He also knew that without it, the man beside him would already be in far worse shape. The math was cruel but clear. Lucas accepted it. He thought briefly of warmth, of the relief it would bring, and then pushed the thought away. Longing was dangerous. It distracted from what needed to be done. Instead, he focused on the man's breathing, on keeping him engaged, on watching for signs that things were getting worse. He asked simple questions, listened to fragmented answers, responded with reassurance he hoped would hold. As the minutes stretched on, Lucas felt himself becoming more exposed, more vulnerable than he had been in years. Yet alongside that vulnerability was something else, something steadier, a sense of purpose that cut through fear. He was doing what needed to be done. Whatever the outcome, this moment would not be defined by avoidance or regret. Lucas pulled his arms tighter around himself when the wind shifted again, his body shuddering despite his effort to stay controlled. He leaned closer to the old man, positioning himself to block as much of the wind as he could, even without his jacket. The night pressed in, unforgiving and cold, but Lucas Reed stayed where he was, having given up the one thing that protected him so someone else might have a chance to make it through. The collapse came without warning, sudden and terrifying in its finality. One moment the old man was leaning against Lucas, his weight heavy but manageable, and the next his legs simply stopped responding. There was no dramatic cry, no clear signal that his body was giving out. His knees buckled as if the strength had been drained from them all at once. And Lucas felt the full force of his weight shift dangerously. Instinct took over. Lucas tightened his grip and staggered back a step, barely managing to keep both of them from crashing onto the frozen sidewalk. "I've got you," Lucas said quickly, though his voice strained with effort. His arms trembled as he lowered the old man toward the ground, guiding him as carefully as he could. The man's head lolled forward, breath shallow and uneven, his face pale beneath the harsh glow of the security lights. Lucas knelt beside him, heart pounding, fear spiking sharply. This was what he had been trying to prevent. This was the moment he knew might come. The old man's body felt heavier now, less responsive, as if whatever strength he had left had been spent. Lucas checked him quickly, placing a hand on his shoulder, then near his chest, watching for movement. The man was still breathing, but each breath looked like work. Lucas scanned the street again, desperation rising, but there was still no one. The neighborhood remained eerily unchanged, warm houses sealed shut, the world continuing without acknowledging what was happening on its doorstep. Lucas knew they couldn't stay where they were. Lying exposed on the sidewalk would drain what little warmth remained in minutes. He needed shelter, even if it was minimal. His eyes darted across the townhouse facade, searching for anything that could help. That was when he noticed it through a shallow alcove set back from the gate, partially hidden by stonework and iron railings. Beneath it, near ground level, a vent released a faint stream of warm air, barely noticeable but unmistakable once seen. It wasn't much, it wouldn't save them outright, but it was something, and something was better than nothing. Lucas made a decision instantly. He slid his arms under the old man's shoulders and knees, bracing himself for the effort. The man groaned softly as Lucas lifted, the sound sending a jolt of urgency through him. Lucas adjusted his grip, careful not to drop him, and shuffled toward the alcove step by step. The strain was immediate and intense. Lucas's muscles protested, his arms burning, his back screaming under the uneven weight. He moved slowly, deliberately, knowing that one slip could undo everything. Snow crunched under his boots as he edged closer to the wall, finally reaching the recessed space. He lowered the old man carefully, positioning him so his back rested against the stone and his legs were tucked inward, protected from direct exposure. Lucas collapsed down beside him, chest heaving. The warmth from the vent was faint but real, brushing against his skin like a fragile promise. He shifted the old man closer to it, adjusting his position inch by inch until the warm air touched his hands and face. The difference was subtle, but Lucas could see it immediately. The man's breathing eased just slightly, the sharp edge of distress dulling enough to matter. "Okay," Lucas said, more to himself than to the man. "This helps, we all right here." He didn't believe the words fully, but speaking them steadied him. He adjusted the jacket again, tucking it tighter around the man's shoulders, making sure it stayed between the fragile body and the cold stone. Without his own jacket, Lucas felt the chill biting deeper into him, but he leaned closer, using his body as a shield against the worst of the wind. The alcove felt like a fragile pocket carved out of an uncaring world. Just a few feet away, the sidewalk remained open and exposed, but here the stone walls broke the wind enough to matter. The vent hummed quietly, releasing warmth that felt precious beyond measure. Lucas positioned himself carefully, angling his body to block the draft that still found its way inside. He pressed his back against the stone, ignoring the cold seeping through his clothes. The old man stirred slightly, his head shifting against the wall, his eyes opened halfway, unfocused but aware enough to register Lucas's presence. "I'm tired," he murmured, the words slurring together. The sound tightened something in Lucas's chest. Tired was dangerous. Tired meant drifting away, losing the fight to stay alert. "I know," Lucas said gently, "but stay with me, all right? Just keep talking." He leaned closer, making sure the man could hear him clearly. "Tell me about your daughter, Evelyn, right?" The name seemed to anchor him. The old man nodded faintly, lips moving as he tried to form a response. His words came out broken, pieces of memories stitched together imperfectly. Lucas listened intently, nodding along, responding where he could, asking small questions to keep him engaged. The content mattered less than the connection. As long as the man kept responding, he was still present. Minutes stretched unpredictably, each one blending into the next. Lucas shifted his position whenever numbness crept too far into his limbs, flexing his fingers and toes as subtly as possible. He couldn't afford large movements, they would expose both of them to more cold. Instead, he focused on staying aware, monitoring the old man's condition, watching for changes that might signal things were worsening. The vent's warmth rose and fell in faint pulses, never enough to be comfortable but enough to slow the loss. Lucas leaned into it whenever he could, angling his hands and forearms to catch the heat before repositioning to shield the old man again. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant adjustment. Lucas felt himself growing more tired, the effort of staying alert taxing his already depleted reserves. He thought briefly about how absurd it was that this tiny vent, probably installed for convenience rather than survival, had become their lifeline. The house behind the wall was warm, insulated, protected, its occupants likely unaware that its excess heat was the only thing standing between two lives in the night. The thought didn't make Lucas angry. It simply felt surreal. The old man's shivering lessened slightly, though it didn't stop. Lucas took that as another small victory. He kept talking, telling the man his own name, reminding him where they were, explaining what they were doing. Repetition became a tool, grounding both of them in the present moment. Every response from the man, no matter how weak, felt like proof that staying here mattered. As time passed, Lucas became increasingly aware of his own condition. His teeth chattered uncontrollably now, and his hands felt clumsy, coordination slipping just enough to worry him. He pressed his arms tighter against his body when he wasn't using them to shield the man, conserving heat where he could. He knew the signs, he knew he was pushing his limits. But he also knew that moving again would undo the fragile progress they had made. The alcove was not safe, it was simply safer. Lucas understood that clearly. They could not spend the entire night here without serious risk. But until help arrived, until something changed, this was the best option available. Lucas had learned to work with imperfect solutions. Survival rarely offered perfect ones. He glanced toward the street again, eyes stinging from cold and fatigue. The night looked unchanged, indifferent, but Lucas refused to let that discourage him. He had made it this far. He had kept the old man alive through collapse, through exposure, through the worst moments of the night so far. That had to count for something. Lucas leaned closer, placing a steady hand on the old man's shoulder, feeling the faint warmth beginning to return there. "You're doing good," he said softly. "Just stay with me." The words carried determination more than comfort. He was committed now, fully and without reservation. In that narrow alcove, warmed only by a vent and held together by stubborn resolve, Lucas Reed stayed alert, fighting the cold minute by minute. The old man rested against the stone, breathing still and even but steady enough to give hope. The night pressed on, relentless and unforgiving, but for the moment, Lucas had carved out a fragile foothold against it, and he was not letting go. Lucas knew the moment he reached into his backpack that there would be no taking this back. His fingers brushed the familiar fabric, thin and worn smooth by years of use, and a wave of memory hit him so hard it nearly stole his breath. The blanket had always been there, folded carefully at the bottom of his bag, untouched except on the coldest nights. It was the last thing he had promised himself he would protect no matter what. Yet as he looked at the old man beside him, slumped against the stone and barely holding on, Lucas understood that the promise was being tested now, not later. He pulled the blanket free slowly, unfolding it with care despite the urgency pressing down on him. The fabric looked fragile in the harsh light, its frayed edges and thin patches offering little in the way of real insulation. Still, it was warmer than nothing, and more importantly, it was something he could share. Lucas draped it first over the old man's shoulders, tucking it carefully around his chest and legs, then adjusted it again so there was enough length left to pull around himself as well. He positioned it so their bodies were close, heat shared rather than wasted. As soon as the blanket settled around them, Lucas felt the difference. Not warmth exactly, but a slowing of the cold's advance. The fabric trapped what little heat remained between their bodies, creating a fragile pocket against the night. Lucas leaned in, pressing his side and shoulder against the old man, mindful of keeping the blanket sealed as best he could. His own teeth chattered uncontrollably now, his muscles tightening in protest, but he focused on the man's breathing, on keeping it steady. The old man stirred, eyes fluttering open briefly as Lucas adjusted the blanket. His gaze drifted downward, registering the fabric with faint recognition. "That's you shouldn't," he murmured, voice weak but concerned. "You need it." Lucas shook his head even though the man could barely see the gesture. "It's okay," he said. "We resharing." The explanation felt insufficient, but words rarely captured the truth of things like this. The blanket carried the faint scent of detergent and something older, something tied to afternoons spent in a cramped apartment with the radiator ticking unevenly. Lucas remembered his grandfather sitting on the couch, the blanket pulled around his shoulders, telling stories that wandered through decades without needing an ending. He remembered the warmth of sitting beside him, feeling protected even when the world outside felt uncertain. Wrapping that same blanket around a stranger felt strange and inevitable all at once, like completing a circle Lucas hadn't known was open. Lucas adjusted their position again, careful to minimize gaps where cold air could creep in. He tucked the blanket beneath his legs, then pulled it tighter around the old man's back, using his own body as a brace. The vent continued to release its faint warmth, brushing against their hands and faces in uneven waves. Lucas angled himself to catch as much of it as possible without exposing the man. It was a constant calculation, one that demanded attention even as fatigue pressed heavier against him. Minutes passed, stretching into something harder to measure. Lucas talked continuously, not loudly, but steadily, offering reassurance, asking simple questions, responding to fragmented answers. The sound of his own voice kept him focused, anchored. He told the old man his name again, explained where they were, reminded him that help would come. He repeated the man's daughter's name, using it as a tether, watching for recognition each time it crossed his lips. The old man responded inconsistently, sometimes forming sentences, sometimes drifting into confusion. Lucas didn't correct him when he mixed up details. Accuracy wasn't the goal, presence was. As long as the man stayed engaged, as long as he reacted, nodded, or answered in some way, Lucas knew he was still fighting. That knowledge fueled him even as his own body began to protest more loudly. Without his jacket and now sharing the blanket, Lucas felt exposed in ways he couldn't fully block. His arms ached from holding position, from maintaining contact that prevented heat from escaping. His legs tingled, then dulled, then tingled again. He shifted subtly whenever sensation faded too far, careful not to break the fragile seal of warmth they had created. Each adjustment cost energy he wasn't sure he had, but not adjusting risked far worse. The night seemed endless, the cold unrelenting. Lucas forced himself to stay alert by counting breaths, by focusing on physical sensations, by recalling memories that kept him grounded. He thought of his grandfather's laugh, of the way he used to tap his fingers absent-mindedly against the arm of the couch. He imagined what Thomas would say if he could see him now. Lucas suspected he would nod, maybe sigh, maybe tell him he was doing the right thing even if it hurt. The blanket slipped once, a small gap opening near the old man's shoulder. Lucas noticed immediately and fixed it, tucking the fabric back into place with stiff fingers. He pressed closer, sharing what little warmth his body still generated. The closeness felt strange at first, then necessary. In situations like this, distance was dangerous, proximity was survival. Lucas became acutely aware of time, of how slowly it moved when every minute demanded effort. He checked the sky whenever he could see it past the stone walls, searching for any sign of lightning, any hint that dawn was approaching. The darkness remained heavy, snow continuing to fall in thick flakes that piled quietly at the edges of the alcove. Lucas brushed them away when they drifted too close, keeping the space as clear as possible. The old man's shivering eased slightly, though it never fully stopped. Lucas took that as a fragile victory. He monitored the man's breathing closely, relieved that it remained steady, even if shallow. He spoke whenever the man's eyes began to close for too long, gently prompting him to respond. "Stay with me," Lucas said more than once, the words carrying both instruction and plea. As the hours dragged on, Lucas felt his own thoughts grow heavier, concentration requiring more effort than before. He recognized the danger in that and fought it fiercely. He refused to let himself drift. He shifted his weight, flexed his hands, focused on the cold biting at his skin as proof that he was still present. Pain in that moment became a tool. It reminded him that he was awake, that he could still act. The blanket, thin as it was, became the center of everything. It represented warmth, memory, sacrifice, and connection all at once. Lucas knew that even if they survived the night, the blanket might not survive intact. It could tear further, lose what little usefulness it had left. That thought no longer bothered him. Objects mattered only insofar as they served people. His grandfather had taught him that without ever saying it outright. Lucas leaned his head briefly against the stone wall, eyes open, scanning the street whenever he could. He listened for any change in the environment, any indication that someone might be approaching. He remained vigilant, refusing to let exhaustion win. The night tested him relentlessly, pushing against his limits, demanding more than he had ever given before. Yet beneath the strain, beneath the cold and fear, there was a quiet certainty Lucas had never felt so strongly. He was exactly where he needed to be. He had chosen this, fully and without reservation. Whatever happened next, whatever the outcome, he would not look back on this night and wonder if he should have done more. Wrapped together in a thin blanket that carried the weight of memory and choice, Lucas Reed stayed alert beside the old man, holding the line against the cold minute by minute. The city might have forgotten them, the buildings might have stood indifferent, but here, in this narrow space warmed by shared breath and stubborn resolve, Lucas remained. He stayed. The night stretched out in a way that felt almost unreal, as if time itself had slowed to test how long a person could endure. Lucas lost track of minutes early on. What mattered was not how much time had passed, but how much still remained before morning. He could feel it in his body, the deep, grinding fatigue that came from cold, fear, and constant effort layered on top of weeks of exhaustion. Yet he refused to let himself slip into autopilot. Staying aware was as important as staying warm. Lucas kept talking because talking gave the night shape. Without it, the hours threatened to blur together into something dangerous. He spoke steadily, carefully choosing words that would hold the old man's attention without overwhelming him. He asked about Evelyn again, about where she lived, about what kind of work she did. Sometimes the man answered clearly, describing things that sounded real and grounded. Other times his responses wandered, memories bleeding into one another in ways that made little sense. Lucas accepted all of it without correction. The point wasn't accuracy, the point was connection. When the old man's eyes drooped for too long, Lucas gently prompted him again, asking simple questions, repeating familiar names. He learned quickly which topics brought the man back into focus. Family worked best. Familiar routines helped. The old man talked about breakfasts, about walks he used to take, about a house that sounded warm and full of life. Lucas listened closely, nodding, responding with encouragement. He pictured those moments as he listened, building a mental image of a place where this man belonged, where he should be right now instead of here. Lucas shared pieces of his own story in return, though he filtered them carefully. He talked about his grandfather, about growing up in Queens, about learning how to fix things even when the tools were missing. He spoke about ordinary moments, not the painful ones. He knew better than to dive into memories that might pull him too far inward. Still, speaking his grandfather's name aloud brought a strange comfort. It felt like keeping him close, like drawing strength from a presence that had shaped him. The cold never stopped working against them. It crept in whenever Lucas shifted, whenever the blanket loosened even slightly. He adjusted constantly, sealing gaps, leaning closer, using his body as a barrier. His arms grew stiff, his fingers slow to respond. He forced them to move anyway, flexing subtly, pressing them together when numbness threatened to take over. He had learned how quickly cold could turn dangerous if ignored. Lucas checked the old man's breathing regularly, watching the rise and fall of his chest. Each steady breath felt like a small victory. He focused on patterns, on consistency, on signs that the man was still present and engaged. When the man spoke, even softly, Lucas felt a rush of relief that cut through his own discomfort. As long as the man was responding, they were still in the fight. The city offered no help during those hours. Traffic sounds were distant and infrequent. The neighborhood settled into a deep, insulated night. Snow continued to fall, thick flakes drifting into the alcove despite Lucas's efforts to brush them away. He cleared them whenever he noticed, mindful that even a thin layer could sap heat quickly. His movements were deliberate and economical. Every action cost energy. At some point, Lucas realized he was shivering harder than before. His jaw clenched tightly, teeth chattering despite his effort to control it. He recognized the danger signs immediately. He adjusted his position again, pressing closer to the old man, drawing what warmth he could from shared contact. The irony wasn't lost on him, two people surviving by leaning on each other, neither with enough to endure alone. Lucas's thoughts grew heavier as the night wore on. Concentration required more effort now. He fought that by anchoring himself in the present moment. He described the street around them out loud, naming things he could see when the old man's attention drifted. He counted breaths under his own breath, using rhythm to stay focused. He reminded himself repeatedly that morning would come, that night never lasted forever no matter how endless it felt. The old man's voice weakened at times, his responses slower, more fragmented. Each time that happened, Lucas felt a surge of urgency. He raised his voice slightly, not loud but firm, encouraging the man to answer, to stay engaged. "Tell me again," Lucas would say. "About your house, about Evelyn." The repetition wasn't annoying, it was necessary. Familiar ground kept the man oriented enough to hold on. Lucas thought about the risk he was taking more than once. He knew that if he lost awareness, if he let fatigue pull him under, the consequences could be severe. He didn't let that fear paralyze him. Instead, he used it as fuel. He reminded himself why he was here, why walking away had never been an option. The clarity of that decision still held even as the cost of it mounted. There were moments when Lucas's vision blurred slightly, when the edges of the world felt softer, less defined. Each time he corrected immediately, shifting his weight, moving his arms, speaking more deliberately. He refused to let himself drift. He had seen what happened when people underestimated the cold. He would not make that mistake. The old man reached out once, his hand brushing Lucas's arm through the blanket. The touch was weak but intentional, a brief gesture of reassurance or gratitude. Lucas covered the man's hand with his own, squeezing gently to let him know he was there. The contact grounded them both. In that small exchange, Lucas felt the weight of the night ease just slightly. They were not alone in this moment. They were facing it together. As hours passed, Lucas became keenly aware of every sensation in his body. The ache in his shoulders, the stiffness in his legs, the dull burn in his fingers. He cataloged them without judgment, using awareness as a tool rather than a source of panic. Pain meant he was still conscious. Cold meant he was still present. As long as he could feel, he could act. He continued to talk, his voice growing hoarse but steady. He told stories his grandfather used to tell him, ones he remembered almost by heart. Stories about neighbors, about jobs that went wrong, about ordinary people doing the best they could. The old man listened when he could, responding with nods or brief comments. Lucas didn't mind carrying most of the conversation. What mattered was keeping the thread unbroken. At some point, Lucas noticed the sky beginning to change almost imperceptibly, the darkness thinning just enough to suggest movement toward morning. It was subtle, easy to miss, but it filled him with renewed determination. Dawn meant a shift. Dawn meant people would begin to move again. Dawn meant the night's grip would loosen, if only slightly. Lucas leaned in closer, his voice firm but calm. "You're doing good," he said again. "We're almost there." He didn't know exactly how close they were to safety, but he believed deeply in the power of reassurance. Hope, even fragile hope, could keep a person engaged when their body wanted to give up. The long night tested Lucas in ways he had never experienced before. It stripped away comfort, certainty, and reserve, leaving only resolve. He stayed awake by force of will, by memory, by responsibility. He stayed present because leaving, even mentally, was not an option. Wrapped together against the cold, talking through the darkest hours, Lucas Reed held the line. He kept the old man engaged, kept himself alert, and kept believing that staying was worth the cost. The city still did not notice them. The building still stood indifferent. But in that alcove under falling snow and faint warmth from a vent, two lives continued to push forward through the night, one conversation at a time. Sometime deep into the night, Lucas realized his body was beginning to betray him. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't dramatic. It arrived quietly, disguised as heaviness, as a dull pressure settling into his limbs. His arms felt thick, slow to respond as if moving through water. His legs ached constantly now, not the sharp pain of cold but a deeper exhaustion that pulsed with every heartbeat. He recognized the signs immediately, and the recognition scared him more than the cold itself. His thoughts no longer came as cleanly as before. He had to work harder to hold on to them, to keep them lined up and useful. Concentration slipped when he wasn't careful, his attention threatening to drift away from the present moment. Lucas fought that instinct with everything he had. He straightened slightly, shifted his weight, flexed his fingers until sensation flared again. He could not afford to lose awareness now, not when the margin was already so thin. The old man leaned heavily against him, his weight constant, grounding. Lucas focused on that contact, using it as an anchor. As long as he could feel the man's body pressed against his own, as long as he could sense the rise and fall of his chest, Lucas knew he was still engaged. He checked that rhythm repeatedly, watching carefully, relieved each time it remained steady. The man was still here. That had to count for something. Lucas's teeth no longer chattered the way they had earlier. That absence worried him. He knew enough to understand what it meant when the body stopped fighting so visibly. He forced himself to move again, rubbing his arms through the blanket, pressing his hands together, anything to spark response. Sensation returned in brief flashes, sharp and unpleasant, but he welcomed it. Pain meant he was still present. He leaned closer to the old man, positioning himself to block the wind more fully, even though doing so increased his own exposure. The blanket slipped slightly as he adjusted, and he fixed it immediately, tucking it back around both of them with stiff fingers. Every movement felt deliberate now, each action requiring conscious effort. His body wanted rest. Lucas refused to give it that permission. The old man stirred, his head shifting against Lucas's shoulder. His eyes opened halfway, unfocused but searching. "Are you still here?" he asked, his voice thin, uncertain. The question cut through Lucas more sharply than the cold ever could. He swallowed, forcing his voice to stay steady. "Yeah," Lucas said, "I'm right here. Not going anywhere." He meant it in every sense of the phrase. The man nodded faintly, his grip tightening slightly on the blanket. "Don't leave," he said, fear threading through the words. Lucas felt something tighten in his chest. He remembered being younger, standing in hospital hallways, asking the same thing of adults who didn't always stay. He placed a firm hand on the man's shoulder, grounding them both. "I won't," he said. "I promise." That promise became the center of everything. It cut through the fog, threatening to gather in Lucas's mind. Promises mattered. His grandfather had taught him that long before everything fell apart. A promise wasn't something you made lightly, and it wasn't something you abandoned when it became inconvenient. Lucas clung to that belief now, using it as a shield against the creeping weakness in his body. He felt himself growing colder in ways he couldn't fully counteract. The warmth from the vent seemed more distant, less effective. He angled himself toward it again, catching what little heat it offered before repositioning to protect the old man. The balancing act demanded constant attention, and Lucas forced himself to remain methodical. Panic would waste energy, he couldn't afford that. Lucas's vision blurred briefly, the edges of the world softening. He blinked hard, shaking his head slightly, bringing his focus back to the stone wall in front of him. He named objects in his mind, grounding himself in specifics: the iron railing, the cracked mortar, the snow collecting at the base of the wall. Details anchored him, keeping his awareness sharp enough to function. He spoke again, even though his throat felt raw. He told the old man his name once more, repeating it slowly. He reminded him where they were and what they were doing. He spoke about waiting for morning, about how people would be out soon, about how they just needed to hold on a little longer. Whether or not those assurances were true in a strict sense didn't matter. They gave shape to endurance. Lucas felt a strange calm settle over him as the night reached its deepest point. Fear was still there, but it no longer dominated him. He had accepted the risk fully. Fighting it now would only drain him faster. Instead, he focused on what he could control: his position, his attention, his commitment to the man beside him. Everything else was noise. He thought about his grandfather again, vividly this time. He imagined him sitting nearby, watching, maybe shaking his head at the stubbornness of it all. Lucas could almost hear his voice, low and steady, telling him he was doing right even if it cost him. The thought brought unexpected strength. Lucas leaned into it, letting memory fill the gaps where physical energy was fading. The cold crept deeper, settling into his core in a way that made his movements slower, heavier. He recognized the danger but refused to surrender to it. He pressed his back against the stone, pushed his feet against the ground, kept pressure in his muscles to maintain engagement. He stayed alert by force of will alone, drawing on reserves he hadn't known he had. The old man shifted again, his breathing hitching briefly before settling. Lucas reacted immediately, adjusting their position, murmuring reassurance. He monitored every change, every pause, every sign of struggle. As long as the man was responding, Lucas would not stop. That became his rule, his boundary, his line in the night. There was a moment when Lucas wondered, fleetingly, whether this was how it ended. Not with chaos or drama, but with exhaustion and cold and the quiet determination to stay. The thought didn't frighten him as much as he expected. What frightened him was the idea of letting go, of breaking the promise he had just made. That fear outweighed everything else. Lucas tightened his grip on the blanket, drawing it closer around them both. His hands shook slightly, coordination imperfect, but the motion held. He leaned his head briefly against the wall, eyes open, forcing himself to keep scanning the street. He refused to close them for more than a blink at a time. He knew better. Rest was dangerous now. "I'm still here," he said again, mostly to himself. The words grounded him, reinforced his presence. He adjusted his posture once more, aligning his body to protect the old man as fully as possible. Whatever strength he had left would be spent here, in this position, doing this one thing. The night did not ease, the cold did not soften, but Lucas Reed did not move. He stayed anchored in that narrow alcove, holding onto his promise with everything he had. His body weakened, his thoughts slowed, but his resolve remained unbroken. At the edge of his endurance, with the cold pressing closer and morning still uncertain, Lucas chose again to stay. Not because it was safe, not because it was smart, but because leaving was no longer an option he could live with. The night loosened its grip slowly, reluctantly, as if it did not want to release what it had taken hold of. Lucas noticed the change not through light at first, but through a subtle shift in the air. The cold was still brutal, but it felt less sharp, less aggressive, as though the city itself were beginning to stir. Snow continued to fall, though the flakes seemed heavier now, drifting downward instead of cutting sideways with the wind. Lucas lifted his head slightly, eyes burning, searching the sky beyond the stone walls for any hint that morning was on its way. His body felt distant, as if sensation had to travel farther to reach him. Moving even an inch required intention. Still, he stayed alert, because he had promised he would. The old man remained pressed against him, breathing shallow but steady, his weight familiar now, grounding. Lucas kept one hand anchored on the man's shoulder, the other gripping the blanket to keep it from slipping. He had narrowed his world down to a few essential tasks: stay present, keep the man warm, watch the street. A faint grayness crept into the edges of the sky, almost imperceptible at first. Lucas blinked several times, unsure if exhaustion was distorting his vision. He focused harder, forcing clarity. The darkness was thinning. That realization sparked something inside him, not relief exactly, but resolve renewed. Morning meant movement. Morning meant people. Morning meant a chance. The old man stirred, his head shifting slightly. "Is it time?" he asked, his voice weak but hopeful. Lucas leaned closer, careful not to disturb their position too much. "Almost," he said. "You did good. Just stay with me." The man nodded faintly, eyes fluttering, and Lucas felt a surge of urgency. They were close now. He couldn't let things slip at the last stretch. Lucas straightened as much as his body allowed and scanned the street again. The neighborhood still looked untouched, pristine in its wealth and order, but there were signs of life beginning to return. A light flicked on behind a window. Somewhere in the distance, a car engine started, then another. The city was waking up, unaware of how narrowly two lives had been holding on beneath its notice. Then came the headlights. They swept across the street unexpectedly, bright and sudden, cutting through the early dawn. Lucas flinched slightly, blinking against the glare. The car slowed as it approached the townhouse, then stopped abruptly. A door opened and a figure stepped out quickly, posture tense, movements sharp with urgency. Lucas recognized the emotion before he recognized the person. Fear, desperation, relief tangled tightly together. "Dad," a woman's voice called out, breaking across the street with raw urgency. "Dad." She moved faster now, heels slipping slightly on the icy pavement as she rushed toward the alcove. Lucas tried to speak, to answer, but his voice failed him at first. He swallowed, gathering what strength he had left. "He's here," Lucas managed, the words scraping out of a dry throat. "He's right here." The woman appeared at the edge of the alcove, her face illuminated by the growing light. She froze for a split second, taking in the scene at her father slumped against the wall, wrapped in a thin jacket and a worn blanket, and a teenage boy beside him, pale and shaking, holding him upright with sheer determination. "Oh my God," she breathed, dropping to her knees beside them. Her hands hovered uncertainly for a moment before touching her father's face, then his shoulders, as if reassuring herself that he was real, that he was alive. "Dad, I'm here," she said, her voice breaking. "I've got you." The old man stirred at the sound of her voice, recognition flickering across his features. "Evelyn," he murmured, relief softening his expression. "I was looking for you." Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, gripping his hand. "I know, you're safe now." Lucas watched the exchange through a haze, the edges of the moment blurring as exhaustion surged. He forced himself to stay upright, to keep his grip steady until help fully took over. He didn't want to collapse now, not after making it this far. Evelyn looked up at him then, really seeing him for the first time. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in his condition, the lack of a jacket, the way his hands shook. She'd asked, her voice thick with disbelief, "You stayed with him?" Lucas nodded faintly. "He was lost," he said. "I couldn't leave." The simplicity of the explanation felt almost inadequate compared to the weight of what had happened. Evelyn pulled out her phone with shaking hands, already calling for help, her voice clipped and urgent as she explained the situation. Lucas listened distantly, the words blending together. He focused instead on staying upright, on not letting his body give out before it was safe to do so. The old man leaned more heavily against Evelyn now, and Lucas gently shifted, easing some of the weight off his own shoulders while still keeping the blanket in place. Sirens became audible in the distance, faint at first, then growing louder. Lucas felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension twist through him. Help was coming, that was good. But with help came questions, attention, scrutiny. He had lived long enough on the margins to know that being noticed was a double-edged thing. Still, he reminded himself that this wasn't about him. It never had been. Evelyn glanced at him again, her expression changing as she registered just how unsteady he looked. "Sit back," she said gently but firmly, "please. You were not okay." Lucas tried to argue, but the effort drained what little energy he had left. He nodded instead, easing himself back against the stone, his legs finally protesting loudly as he shifted. The emergency vehicle arrived moments later, lights flashing against the townhouses, breaking the early morning calm. Paramedics moved quickly, efficiently, kneeling beside the old man, assessing his condition, asking questions. Evelyn answered them rapidly, her voice steadier now that help was present. One of the paramedics turned to Lucas, eyes sharp with concern. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. "All night," Evelyn answered before Lucas could. She looked at Lucas again, something like awe and grief mingling in her gaze. "He stayed with my father all night." The paramedic's expression shifted immediately. "We need to check you too," he said. Lucas tried to wave it off, but his arm barely lifted. He felt hands guiding him, a blanket placed over his shoulders, warmth seeping in slowly, painfully. He hissed softly as sensation returned in sharp bursts. The discomfort was intense, but it meant he was still here. As they lifted the old man onto a stretcher, Lucas watched Evelyn walk alongside him, her hand never leaving her father's. She glanced back at Lucas once more, her eyes filling again. "Thank you," she said, the words simple but weighted with everything they carried. Lucas nodded weakly, unable to form a response that felt adequate. The street around them began to fill with early morning activity, curious glances cast from a distance, the city reasserting itself as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. For Lucas, the world felt unreal, stretched thin by exhaustion and relief. He felt himself being guided toward another stretcher, heard voices asking his name, his age, questions he answered as best he could. As the ambulance doors closed and the city rolled past in fragments of light and motion, Lucas allowed himself one final thought before the weight of warmth and fatigue pulled him deeper inward. He had stayed, he had kept his promise. Whatever came next, that truth would remain. Warmth came back to Lucas in waves, each one sharper than the last. It wasn't the gentle relief he might have imagined. It was almost painful, a deep ache spreading through his hands, his feet, his chest, as circulation returned too quickly for comfort. He groaned softly, eyes fluttering open as unfamiliar sounds filled the space around him. Beeping monitors, muffled voices, the low hum of machinery. For a moment, panic surged through him, his body tensing instinctively. Hospitals meant questions, hospitals meant paperwork, hospitals meant bills he had no way to pay. A nurse noticed his movement immediately and stepped closer, her expression calm but alert. "Easy," she said, placing a steady hand on his arm. "You safe, you in the emergency department." Lucas swallowed hard, his throat dry, his head pounding. Memories rushed back in fragments, the cold, the alk of the blanket, the old man's weight against him. "The man," Lucas rasped. "Henry. Is he?" Couldn't finish the sentence. "He's stable," the nurse replied gently. "Hypothermia, but they got him here in time. You did something remarkable out there." Lucas closed his eyes briefly, relief washing over him stronger than the heat. Henry was alive, that was all that mattered. As the nurse adjusted the blanket around him, Lucas became aware of how exposed he felt without his jacket. Without the familiar weight of his backpack. "My bag," he said weakly. "Did anyone?" "It's here," the nurse assured him, gesturing toward a chair nearby. "We didn't lose anything." Lucas nodded, tension easing slightly. He stared up at the ceiling, letting his breathing slow, reminding himself that the night was over. He had made it through. The curtain beside his bed shifted, and a woman stepped into view. Lucas recognized her immediately, even though she looked different now, hair slightly disheveled, eyes red and swollen, coat draped loosely over her arm. Evelyn Caldwell stood there for a moment, as if unsure whether she was allowed to cross the space between them. When she spoke, her voice carried exhaustion, gratitude, and something deeper that Lucas couldn't quite name. "Hi," she said slightly. "I'm Evelyn. I'm Henry's daughter." Lucas nodded, pushing himself up slightly despite the ache in his body. "He kept calling for you," Lucas said. "I tried to keep him talking." Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling again. "I know," she said. "The doctors told me everything they could. They said if you hadn't stayed with him." Her voice broke, and she stopped, pressing her lips together to regain control. She pulled a chair closer and sat down, leaning forward with her elbows on her knees. "I've watched the security footage," she continued quietly, "from the house across the street. I saw you take off your jacket. I saw you hold him when he collapsed. I saw you stay there all night." She looked up at Lucas, then really looked at him, as if trying to reconcile what she had seen with the pale, exhausted teenager in front of her. "You almost died out there," she said. "It wasn't an accusation, it was an acknowledgement." Lucas shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to being the focus of attention like this, especially not praise. He needed help, he said simply. "I couldn't leave." The words sounded small in the hospital room, but they were the truth. Evelyn shook her head slowly. "Most people would have," she said. "Most people would have walked past or made a call and kept going. You didn't." She took a shaky breath. "You saved my father's life." The weight of that statement hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Lucas looked down at his hands, now pink and sore, as feeling returned fully. He didn't know how to respond to gratitude that felt this large. A doctor stepped in briefly, checking Lucas's vitals, explaining that his body temperature had dropped dangerously low. "You were lucky," the doctor said matter-of-factly. "Another hour or two out there, and this would have been a very different conversation." Lucas nodded, absorbing the information without reaction. He had known how close it was. Hearing it confirmed didn't change much. When the doctor left, Evelyn remained. She studied Lucas carefully, her gaze thoughtful now rather than frantic. "They asked me where you'd be going after you redischarged," she said. Lucas stiffened slightly, instinct kicking in again. "I'll figure something out," he replied quickly. "I always do." It was the answer he had given countless times before, the one that kept conversations from going places he didn't want them to go. Evelyn didn't accept it. "Where were you staying before tonight?" she asked gently. Lucas hesitated, then shrugged. "A place downtown." "Temporary. I had to leave yesterday." He waited for the questions that usually followed, the subtle shift in tone. They didn't come, not right away. "Do you have family?" Evelyn asked. Lucas shook his head. "No, I am. Anywhere safe to go." Another shake. The truth settled into the room, undeniable now. Lucas Reed had nowhere to go. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. She looked past Lucas for a moment, as if replaying the night again in her mind. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier, resolved. "You gave my father everything you had," she said. "Your jacket, your blanket, your body heat. You stayed when it cost you your safety." She met Lucas's eyes directly. "I'm not letting you walk back out into the cold with nothing." Lucas frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "You don't have to," he started. "I know I don't have to," Evelyn interrupted gently. "I want to." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I have a guest house on my property. It's empty. It's warm. It's safe. You can stay there while you recover. No conditions, no deadlines." Lucas stared at her, certain he had misunderstood. Offers like that didn't happen, not to people like him. "I can't afford," he began, his voice trailing off. Evelyn shook her head. "This isn't about money," she said firmly. "This is about decency, about doing the right thing when it matters." He searched her face for hesitation, for pity, for anything that suggested this was a temporary impulse she would regret later. He found none. What he saw instead was gratitude mixed with determination. "You don't even know me," Lucas said quietly. Evelyn's expression softened. "I know enough," she replied. "I know who you were when no one was watching." The nurse returned then, interrupting the moment, explaining discharge timelines, recovery instructions. Lucas listened distantly, his mind still fixed on what Evelyn had said. Stay warm. Safe. The words felt unreal, like something meant for someone else. Before Evelyn stood to leave, she placed a small folded item on the tray beside Lucas's bed. He recognized it instantly. His grandfather's blanket, now clean, neatly folded, the frayed edges intact. His throat tightened. "We washed it," she said softly. "I hope that's okay." Lucas nodded, unable to speak for a moment. He reached out and touched the fabric, grounding himself in its familiarity. "Thank you," he managed finally, though the words felt inadequate. Evelyn shook her head. "No," she said. "Thank you." She stood, then paused at the curtain. Rest, she added. We will talk more soon. As she left, Lucas leaned back against the pillow, the warmth of the room finally settling into his bones. For the first time in years, he wasn't calculating where he would sleep that night. The truth of that realization hit him slowly, carefully, as if afraid to startle him. He closed his eyes, clutching the blanket lightly, and let himself breathe. The night had taken nearly everything from him, but it had also given him something he hadn't expected, proof that staying, even when it cost everything, could change the course of a life. Leaving the hospital felt unreal to Lucas, as if he were stepping out of one life and into another without fully understanding how the shift had happened. His body was still weak, movements careful and measured, but the warmth clung to him now in a way that no longer hurt. Evelyn walked beside him through the sliding doors, her pace adjusted to match his, her attention steady and protective without being overbearing. Outside, the morning air felt gentler than the night before, cold but survivable. And for the first time in years, Lucas didn't brace himself against it out of habit. The drive to Evelyn's home passed in fragments. Lucas watched the city roll by through the window, streets transitioning from concrete density to quieter, tree-lined avenues. Snow clung to branches and rooftops, turning the landscape into something almost unreal. Evelyn drove with both hands on the wheel, focused, composed, yet there was a tension beneath her calm. Every few minutes, she glanced at Lucas to make sure he was all right, adjusting the heat slightly higher each time. When they arrived, Lucas hesitated before stepping out of the car. The property felt vast, more space than he knew how to process. Stone walls framed the entrance, and beyond them stood the main house, tall and solid, its windows catching the pale winter light. Evelyn guided him past it toward a smaller structure set a short distance away. The guest house, she explained, it's private. You'll have your own space. Lucas nodded, unsure how to respond. Privacy was not something he had grown used to. Inside, warmth wrapped around him immediately. The air smelled faintly of clean wood and fresh laundry. The space was simple but elegant, a small living area, kitchenette, a bedroom with a real bed dressed in thick blankets, and a bathroom that gleamed with cleanliness. Lucas stopped just inside the doorway, overwhelmed by the quiet order of it all. He set his backpack down carefully, as if afraid it didn't belong here. Take your time, Evelyn said gently. There's no rush. She showed him how the thermostat worked, where the extra blankets were, how to use the shower safely given his condition. Her tone was practical, grounding, as if anchoring him to the reality of what she was offering. Before she left him to rest, she placed a small stack of folded clothes on the chair by the bed. They should fit, she said. If they don't, we'll fix it. Lucas sat on the edge of the bed after she left, hands resting on his knees, staring at the floor. The bed dipped beneath his weight, soft and unfamiliar. For a long moment, he simply breathed, letting the warmth seep deeper, letting his muscles unclench one by one. He placed his grandfather's blanket carefully at the foot of the bed, smoothing it with reverence. This place was new, but that piece of his past remained constant. The first days passed slowly, deliberately. Lucas slept more than he thought possible, his body finally taking the opportunity to recover. When he woke, food was there, left quietly on the counter or delivered with a gentle knock and a check, in from Evelyn or one of the house staff. No one demanded explanations, no one asked him to justify his presence. The absence of conditions unsettled him at first. He kept expecting the offer to be rescinded, the rules to appear, the clock to start ticking. None of that happened. Evelyn visited him each day, sometimes briefly, sometimes lingering to talk. She asked about his grandfather, about school, about what he liked to do when he wasn't surviving. Lucas answered cautiously at first, then with more ease as he realized she was listening without judgment. She told him about her father's condition, about how the door alarm had malfunctioned that night, about the guilt she carried for not being there. Lucas listened in return, understanding more than she probably realized. One afternoon, as Lucas's strength began to return, Evelyn asked him a question that shifted everything. What do you want to do next? She asked, sitting across from him at the small table in the guest house. Lucas froze, the question catching him off guard. Wanting was dangerous. Wanting implied possibility. He stared down at his hands. I don't know, he admitted. I haven't really planned that far. Evelyn nodded, accepting the answer without pushing. That's okay, she said. We'll figure it out together. They began with small steps, a doctor's appointment to follow up on his recovery, new identification to replace what he had lost over the years, conversations about education, about catching up, about options rather than obligations. Evelyn never framed anything as charity, she framed it as investment. You deserve stability, she told him once, matter-of-factly, everyone does. The turning point came a week later, during a conversation Lucas hadn't known was coming. Evelyn invited him into the main house, into a study lined with books and soft chairs. Her father sat nearby, wrapped in a sweater, watching them with clearer eyes than Lucas remembered from that night. When Henry saw Lucas, his face softened. "You stayed," he said simply. Lucas nodded, unsure what to say. Henry reached out, squeezing his hand with surprising strength. "Thank you," he added. The words carried a weight that settled deep in Lucas's chest. After Henry was settled with a caregiver, Evelyn closed the study door and turned to Lucas. "I want to talk about something important," she said. Lucas's stomach tightened reflexively. This was it, he thought. The moment when the terms appeared. Instead, Evelyn took a breath and said, "I'd like to make this arrangement permanent, if you re willing." Lucas stared at her. "Permanent how?" he asked carefully. Evelyn met his gaze steadily. "Guardianship," she said. "At least until you re-18. Longer if you want it. I want you to have legal stability, not just a place to sleep." The words landed slowly, each one reshaping his understanding of what was being offered. Not shelter, belonging. "I don't want you to feel trapped," Evelyn continued. "This isn't about support. You would have choices, a voice. Protection." Lucas felt his throat tighten. No one had ever framed care that way for him before. He thought of the night in the alcove, of promises made and kept, of how close everything had come to ending. "Why?" he asked quietly. Evelyn didn't hesitate. "Because you showed me who you are when it mattered most," she said, "and because my father is alive." The paperwork took time, lawyers involved, conversations careful and thorough. Lucas attended each meeting, listened to explanations, asked questions he had never thought to ask before. The process felt formal, almost unreal, but with each step something inside him relaxed. There were safeguards now. A structure designed to keep him from falling through the cracks again. Life in the guest house settled into a rhythm. Lucas helped where he could, spent time with Henry on good days, listened to stories that circled familiar ground. He began studying again, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Evelyn encouraged him without pressure, celebrating progress without attaching it to worth. "You re not behind," she told him once. "You re right on time for your life." One evening, as snow fell gently outside, Lucas stood at the window of the guest house, looking back toward the main home. Lights glowed warmly inside. He felt something unfamiliar settle over him, not fear, not vigilance, but ease. For the first time in years, he knew where he would sleep the next night. He knew who would notice if he didn't come home. He knew that staying had changed everything. Evelyn knocked softly and stepped inside. "Dinner's ready," she said. Lucas smiled, a small but genuine expression. "I'll be there," he replied. As he followed her back toward the house, he understood that this place was no longer just shelter. It was the beginning of something durable, something chosen. A family formed not by obligation, but by the simple, powerful act of staying when it mattered most. Years later, when Lucas Reed stood at the front of a small lecture hall, he sometimes thought back to that winter night and felt as though it belonged to another lifetime. He was 21 now, older in ways that had nothing to do with age, steadier in ways he had once believed were impossible. The room in front of him was filled with students studying social work, notebooks open, eyes attentive. They saw him as a guest speaker, a case study brought to life, someone who had made it through. Few of them knew how fragile that phrase really was. Lucas spoke plainly, the way he always did. He told them about systems that failed quietly, about kids who aged out without preparation, about how survival often depended on choices made in moments no one else witnessed. He did not dramatize the night that changed his life. He described it carefully, honestly, emphasizing not the danger but the responsibility. It wasn't about being brave, he said. It was about staying when leaving would have been easier. The students listened, some nodding, some visibly moved. Lucas recognized the looks on their faces. He had worn them once himself. After the lecture, a young man lingered near the door, shifting his weight nervously. Lucas noticed immediately. That awareness never left him. "Hey," Lucas said gently, approaching him. "You okay?" The young man hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't really have anywhere to go tonight," he admitted. "I heard you talk and it sounded familiar." Lucas didn't ask for explanations. He didn't need them. "Come on," he said, "let's get some food and talk." Moments like that filled Lucas's life now, not as burdens but as purpose. He worked part-time with the Caldwell Foundation, the nonprofit Evelyn had established in the years following that night. What began as a small initiative focused on emergency housing had grown into something much larger: transitional homes, education support, job training, and legal advocacy for young people navigating the same cracks Lucas had once fallen through. Evelyn insisted that Lucas help shape every program. "You know what's missing," she told him. "You lived it." Evelyn herself had changed in ways she never anticipated. Before that winter, her life had revolved around meetings, investments, and growth metrics. Success had been measured in numbers and expansion. Now she measured it differently. She came home earlier. She knew the names and stories of the young people the foundation served. She sat with her father on his clear days, listening patiently even when the stories repeated. When people asked her why she had started the foundation, she answered simply, because someone stayed. Henry Caldwell lived his remaining years surrounded by care and presence. His memory faltered more often as time passed, but there were moments of clarity that surprised everyone. In those moments, he always recognized Lucas. He would reach out, squeeze his hand, and say, "You didn't leave." Lucas never corrected him. That truth didn't need elaboration. It was enough. Lucas moved into the main house eventually, not because he had to, but because it felt natural. He became part of daily routines, shared meals, small arguments, celebrations, and disappointments. Family, he learned, wasn't about perfection. It was about consistency. It was about people who noticed when you were gone and waited for you to come back. Education came slowly but steadily. Lucas earned his JED, then enrolled in community college before transferring to a 4-year program. He studied social work not because it looked good on paper, but because it aligned with everything he had lived through. He approached his studies the same way he had approached survival, methodically, persistently, refusing to quit when things got hard. When doubt crept in, as it still did sometimes, Evelyn reminded him how far he had already come. "You held on through a night that nearly killed you," she said once. "You can handle an exam." The foundation's first permanent shelter opened on the anniversary of the night that changed everything. There was no grand ceremony, no press conference. Just a simple gathering of staff, volunteers, and the young people it would serve. A small plaque was mounted near the entrance, its words chosen carefully: "Home is built by those who stay." Lucas stood beside Evelyn as the doors opened, watching teenagers step inside out of the cold, seeing relief flicker across faces he recognized too well. One evening after a long day at the shelter, Lucas drove back to the Caldwell home through gently falling snow. The weather was calm this time, almost beautiful. He parked, stepped out, and paused near the front steps where a small marker had been placed years earlier. He touched it briefly, a private ritual he returned to when he needed grounding. He thought of his grandfather, of the promise he had made without knowing where it would lead. He smiled faintly, gratitude settling deep in his chest. Inside, the house was warm and alive. Evelyn was in the kitchen, trying a new recipe and laughing when it didn't turn out quite right. Henry sat nearby, wrapped in a sweater, humming tunelessly but content. Voices overlapped, footsteps moved through familiar spaces. Lucas set his keys down, feeling the ease of belonging settle around him. Later that night, as Lucas reviewed case notes for the foundation, his phone buzzed with a message from a colleague. Another young person had arrived, freshly aged out, scared and unsure. Lucas typed back immediately, "I'm on my way." He grabbed his jacket, the weight of it familiar but no longer precious in the way it once had been. He knew now that warmth was something meant to be shared. Driving through the city, Lucas reflected on how many lives had intersected because of one decision made under brutal conditions. Henry had lived. Evelyn had found a different definition of success. Dozens of young people now had roofs, opportunities, advocates. And Lucas himself had moved from invisible to essential, from surviving to building something that would outlast him. When he reached the shelter, the young person waiting inside looked up with the same guarded fear Lucas had carried for years. Lucas smiled, the expression genuine and steady. "Hey," he said, "you're safe here, let's figure this out together." The words came easily now, not rehearsed, not forced, they were simply true. Later, back home, Lucas sat at the kitchen table, his grandfather's blanket folded neatly over the back of a chair. It was more threadbare now, its usefulness long since spent, but Lucas kept it close. It reminded him that kindness was not something you saved for when life was comfortable. It was something you practiced when life demanded the most from you. As the night settled gently around the house, Lucas looked around at the life he had built, the family that had formed through choice rather than chance. He knew challenges would continue. He knew the world would not suddenly become fair. But he also knew this staying had changed everything. And every day after that night, in ways large and small, Lucas Reed continued to stay. The deepest lesson of this story is that morality is rarely found in comfort. It does not announce itself when conditions are safe or choices are easy. It appears in moments of strain, exhaustion, and fear, when doing the right thing carries a real cost. Lucas did not act because he was strong, wealthy, prepared, or protected. He acted because he was present. The story reminds us that character is not defined by resources but by response. When Lucas chose to stay, he did not do so with confidence in the outcome. He stayed without knowing if help would come, without knowing if his own body would endure the night. That choice strips morality down to its purest form, deciding who you will be when no one is watching and no reward is guaranteed. Another powerful lesson lies in how society treats vulnerability. Both Lucas and Henry were invisible in different ways, one young and homeless, the other elderly and disoriented. The city around them functioned perfectly well while they suffered unnoticed. This reflects a truth that is uncomfortable but necessary to confront. Systems are often designed to maintain order, not to ensure care. Rules have age limits, buildings have locked doors, and responsibility is frequently outsourced to someone else. The story challenges this structure by showing that real change does not always come from institutions, but from individuals willing to interrupt indifference. Lucas did not fix the system that failed him or Henry, but he refused to let that failure dictate his humanity. The story also teaches that kindness is not passive. It is not simply a feeling or an intention, it is an action that requires endurance. Lucas's kindness was not a single moment of help, it was 8 hours of sustained effort under worsening conditions. This kind of compassion is demanding, it drains energy, exposes weakness, and often goes unnoticed. Yet it is precisely this sustained kindness that transforms lives. The night did not end when Lucas gave up his jacket or shared his blanket. It continued through conversation, vigilance, and refusal to disengage even as his body weakened. The lesson here is that empathy is not proven by gestures alone, but by persistence when fatigue sets in. Another central lesson is that help is not a one-way transaction. The phrase, "the person you save ends up saving you," is often repeated because it reflects a fundamental human truth. Lucas saved Henry's life, but in doing so, he also reshaped his own future. Through that single act, Lucas found safety, family, and direction not because he sought them, but because he acted in alignment with his values. This does not suggest that kindness should be transactional or motivated by reward. Instead, it reveals that human connection has consequences far beyond the immediate moment. When people choose to care, they create bonds that alter trajectories on both sides. The story further teaches that family is not solely defined by blood or obligation. It is defined by presence, responsibility, and choice. Evelyn did not owe Lucas anything by law or convention, yet she recognized that what he gave her father went beyond assistance, it was sacrifice. Her response illustrates that gratitude, when taken seriously, becomes accountability. She did not settle for thanking Lucas and returning to her life. She chose to intervene, to stay, and to build something lasting. The lesson here is that compassion does not end with acknowledgement, it continues through action. When we recognize goodness, we have a responsibility to protect it. Another lesson embedded in the story is the long-term impact of being seen. Lucas's transformation did not begin with material comfort, but with recognition. Someone looked at him and said, "You matter, and your life deserves stability." That moment of being seen altered how Lucas saw himself. It gave him permission to imagine a future rather than merely survive the present. This highlights a critical truth: people do not rise because they are suddenly capable, they rise because someone believes they are worth investing in. Stability creates space for growth. Without it, potential remains trapped in survival mode. The story also warns against romanticizing suffering. Lucas's hardship is not portrayed as noble or necessary, it is shown as dangerous and unjust. His kindness does not erase the reality that he should never have been in that position. The lesson is not that suffering builds character, but that character reveals itself despite suffering. Society must not confuse resilience with acceptability. Just because Lucas survived does not mean the system worked, it means he did. And relying on individuals to compensate for systemic failure is not a solution, it is a moral emergency. Finally, the overarching lesson of the story is that staying matters. Staying with people when they are inconvenient, frightened, confused, or costly is what creates trust, healing, and change. Lucas stayed through cold, exhaustion, and fear. Evelyn stayed when she could have walked away after expressing gratitude. Henry stayed present as best he could, holding on to connection even as memory failed. And later, Lucas stays for others who remind him of who he once was. This continuity of presence is what turns a single night into a legacy. In the end, the story teaches that humanity is not defined by grand achievements, but by small decisions made under pressure. It asks a simple but difficult question when faced with someone who needs help: will you stay or will you walk away? Lucas answered that question once under impossible conditions, and his answer echoed outward, changing many lives. The lesson is clear and demanding: we may not be able to save everyone, but we are always responsible for the choices we make when we are there. And sometimes choosing to stay is enough to change everything. If you found this content helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of my latest videos. If you have any ideas or topics you'd like me to cover, leave a comment below. I always read all your comments.